If you're not a therapist or a healer, but you heard our guest describe the personal transformations they experienced during their compassionate inquiry journeys and wonder, what might that be like for me? There is a program that is offered to anyone who wants to experience the power of Gabor Mate's approach to trauma healing. I'm Kevin Young, and I've been facilitating CI circles since 2022. I've seen people transform in many ways. I've seen people change beliefs, relationships. I've seen people change how they show up in the world. I have seen people literally change how they look in front of my very eyes. There are many, many ways that people change during compassionate inquiry circles. Circles is a 10-week small group experience, and registrations are opened until January 26th. Click the link in the show notes. That'll bring you to a web page that gives you all you'll need to figure out if this is for you.
It's really interesting how we criminalize trauma, and we're criminalizing poverty, and we're criminalizing all these things just by way of how we've been conditioned in society to look at these topics, as opposed to understanding that the perpetrator, if you will, was the original victim. But we often forget. We just think of what they did, the act and the behavior, as opposed to what does it actually mean? What else is going on? What happened? Why did it happen? There's so many ways that we've gone to this mass incarceration standpoint. I just so passionately believe compassionate inquiry can interrupt those pipelines. If people were more knowledgeable and society really knew what was going on, there would be more compassion. I think I have to think that, because I want to believe that humans would ultimately do the right thing when they actually have that deeper understanding for people who've experienced incarceration and substance use and a history of intergenerational trauma.
This is the Gifts of Trauma podcast. Stories of transformation and healing through compassionate inquiry.
Welcome back to the Gifts of Trauma. This is Jim, and I am so excited to be welcoming Brooke Harper here today. How are you doing today, Brooke? I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here. So grateful that you're here and that we could have this conversation. And Brooke, as I was starting to lean into your experiences in the world, you really strike me, I want to say first, as a tapestry of a being. But as soon as I say that, I want to change it and I want to say a mosaic of a being, because I do believe that before me is a woman who looks at different things and takes them apart and rearranges them and creates a pattern that comes from a deep place within herself. Does that feel fair and accurate to you? Yeah, I want to acknowledge, in the spirit of compassionate inquiry, what's happening in my body. And as you say, that is actual goosebumps, because that resonates with me deeply, and experience, and how with compassionate inquiry and immersing myself in it, how I can clearly see also my familial history and trauma and things that I've processed over the years, how that is also informs that mosaic, if you will, in my approach to my professional work and my personal work.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you went through the 2019 cohort. Do you want to talk a little bit about how compassionate inquiry has flavored your work? Yeah, I would say I certainly wasn't prepared for how it would change my life personally, in that sense of understanding what was actually a belief or a perception, and just stripping away all the narratives that we tell ourselves about what happened, because it's less about what happened and looking at what happens inside of us. So I would just say it changed me on a personal level and certainly made me a better therapist. It just goes without saying. I couldn't imagine my life without it, and the lens through which I look at things. And I feel really grateful for that. I remember Sat Dharam was my facilitator, and I remember saying something to Sat Dharam about being able to look at my life through a kaleidoscope now. it's brilliant, really being able to look at all of this and say, these experiences have changed my life in a way that I'm grateful for. I feel grateful to be able to hold space for people while they heal themselves. We're not fixing them or anything like that. So I genuinely just feel extremely grateful and joy, really, to be able to help people and be a container and a safe space for them to heal and come to things on their own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's music to my ears. I have to tell the listeners, just so you're aware what's coming up for me, because I studied criminology in college. Criminology, aka criminal justice. And so this issue we're talking about here is so near and dear to my heart. I'm going to geek out with you a little bit, but what we're about to talk about and demystify or demythify, maybe we should say. We want to start to bust some of these myths that have been built up and we've been so conditioned for so many years about how we define good and bad, aka what constitutes a criminal. And then how do we treat the defined criminal? How do we expect a criminal to change? Criminology really does epitomize the most applied form of philosophy and psychology and sociology that we have, that we can see playing out in our life. If we could change how we think about this particular topic, it would absolutely transform life on Earth as we know it. It really would. It really would.
Yeah.
So I feel that same passion coming from you, and I'd love to hear what brought you down this path.
I think having family members who experienced incarceration and substance use and a history of intergenerational trauma. So understanding it at that level and feeling so much compassion and seeing family members vilified or their belief or perception of them that was incongruent with how I knew them to be. They weren't what happened to them, even before I knew what I wanted to be when I grew up, kind of thing, from a young age, going, wow, like just having a compassion at a young age. So that really informed my experience, informed my journey. And then also seeing, as a family member, seeing gaps in systems and seeing people let down, my own family members. And that really just lighting the fire in my belly, if you will, for change and approach. And when I found Gabor's work many years ago, I cried. I was just like, this is it. This is the kind of work that will change the world. But we have to first look at ourselves through this process of compassionate inquiry. And so I think, again, whether therapists, clinicians, social workers, nurses, no matter what profession we're in, doing this is so important to connect to our essence and look at our own trauma or experience to ensure that we're connected to our essence and doing these things for the right reasons and healing ourselves so that we can hold space for other people is something that I've really felt passionately about for some time and feel really fortunate to have done the work myself. So I know it works.
So we're talking today about the criminal justice system in general.
I actually, before we get into that, just want to acknowledge as a standard, I invite people to say carceral system or juvenile-legal system. So that's the vernacular I will use because I think semantics are really important, especially, again, how we know of compassionate inquiry and just the words we assign to things, right? And I want to just really be clear, there isn't justice being done in these facilities. And so to say it feels antithetical, or I believe is antithetical to what we're doing in the field. And I see you nodding and understand completely. So just for people who maybe aren't familiar with those terms and just inviting them to really shift the narrative. Yeah, so I want to invite you to respond to that.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you so much for saying that. Like I was being a criminology major so long ago in college and still having that criminal justice system just roll off of my tongue. And I just want to be really clear that we're also here today to examine and to explore there is not real justice happening. And we're going to leave the listener with a feeling of possibility
at the end of this conversation, but we're also here to land reality. This is a woman who's walked this path and is going to open a lot of windows
for us to peek in. I also appreciate you offering the term carceral system, because
when we do say words like prison, inmates, really think about, like, we're all conditioned, and we know politically we've all been conditioned to have visceral responses to these words as well. So
from the very outset, I want to thank you for articulating that, and please do continue.
You're welcome. I love that you studied criminal justice and just psycholinguistically how important it is to acknowledge these different words that exist and what they're designed to do to us. It's really interesting because it's like how we then criminalize trauma, and we're criminalizing poverty, and we're criminalizing all these things just by way of how we've been conditioned in society to look at these topics, as opposed to understanding that the perpetrator, if you will, was the original victim. That's been a theme that I've seen throughout my career and my personal experience as well. I think that's really important to acknowledge, but we often forget. We just think of what they did, the act and the behavior, as opposed to what does it actually mean? What else is going on? What happened? Why did it happen? I think that it also is important to recognize the juvenile population, because it really starts there. The school to prison pipeline is a thing, right? The foster care to prison pipeline. There's so many ways that we've gotten to this mass incarceration standpoint. I just so passionately believe compassionate inquiry can interrupt those pipelines.
yeah, let's get right in there. And what I would actually love to do is offer you something that I came across preparing for this conversation that really just hit me in the gut hard. This information was pulled off of the Compassionate Prison Project's website, and they did this incredible job demonstrating through these pie charts, which we're going to put in the show notes so you all can see as we're talking. Overall, they found that 64% of the entire U.S. population has experienced one ACE. That's one adverse childhood experience. And for the listeners, I'm just going to read the first question of the questionnaire that I encountered. Before your 18th birthday, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? And the questionnaire goes on to ask questions such as if you've ever experienced sexual abuse or molestation, and other questions that would kind of elicit the idea of that big T trauma. But I'll read another. Before your 18th birthday, did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or that your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? Yes or no? So that's a sampling of the ACE questionnaire, and we will go ahead and make a really clear link in the show notes if you want to read the entire questionnaire. So getting back to the one ACE experienced by 64% of our general population. When prison populations were studied, it was found that 98% of all inmates had experienced one ACE. And for people that are interested in this conversation, I really urge you to go back and hear the conversation we had with Dr. Ashlyn Query. Basically, as your number of adverse childhood experiences goes up, your risk for significantly poor health outcomes also increases. So now that we have data from these studies working with inmate populations, let's look at a bigger number. So as the ACE study was being done on the general population, according to their data, 15.8% of all respondents reported having at least 4 adverse childhood experiences. When this study was carried over to prison populations, that number jumped to 78.1%. 78.1% of those interviewed reported having at least 4 adverse childhood experiences. And when I see that difference depicted in the pie chart, how much more red is taking up that circle, it's bone-chilling to me. I just want to take a moment to pause and let that sink in for our listeners.
And with the chart, so that's just the people who agreed to take the test. I think that it's probably a lot higher. And certainly in the work that I've done in the populations, I'm thinking now of a place and juvenile legal system facility where there isn't one child that I met that wasn't abused in some way. So I think that's just looking at it from who took this test. It's likely higher, and also what is their understanding of what an ACE is, because our perception or our belief about our experience would also inform how we take that test, the answers. Maybe unwilling to look at it, perhaps not being able to recall, or disassociation that happens in order to cope with those memories. And so all the things that we know that happen within, say, a compassionate inquiry session, person might not even be aware of what qualifies as a trauma, because we talk so much in society about trauma as being what happens to you. And Gabor says it's not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you because of what happens to you. And that constriction, it's about, do people have a deeper understanding of how what happens to them affects them so deeply?
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing those points forward.
We do know that in almost every sort of victim category, there's rampant underreporting.
Yes.
So that's such a great point. And then I love even more what you say about how in a compassionate inquiry session, any of us who've been in one, we know how much we, to survive, underrepresent what happened inside of us.
Absolutely. And that myth, the myth of the happy childhood, right? And how often it's everything was fine. Or was it? It's really startling. It's an onion. We just peel away these layers. And I think it's also really, I'd be remiss if we didn't mention that in these settings, how dangerous it can be to reveal certain things and be vulnerable. So often being sad or just open, how that is a risk, and that carries risk.
Let's zoom in on your experience working with juveniles right now. That's something I've never even considered, is they're not in a safe space in an institution like that. That's a whole other ecosystem of survival. Please tell us more about your experience there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that children of color are disproportionately represented in the juvenile legal system. That's just a fact. We also know that children of color are also disproportionately diagnosed with things like oppositional defiance, conduct disorder, all these pathologies that don't explain and are just labels. So we're pathologizing this childhood experience, and ultimately this childhood experience that is often one of abuse, neglect, being in the foster care system, that is also just the neglect and the abuse that is within that system. So there's just essentially all of these things that this child has experienced that then is impacting the cause of their behavioral issues, but they're just labeled because of these behaviors and given these pathologies without understanding the why.
As you were sharing about the overrepresentation of minorities within the system of incarceration, I wanted to share, just to drop this in for our audience, this one sentence. Take a deep breath and hear this one out. While 14% of all youth under 18 in the U.S. are Black, 42% of boys and 35% of girls in juvenile facilities are Black. And I think it's also important to point out that this is when we exclude youth held in Indian County facilities. American Indians make up 3% of the girls and 1.5% of boys in juvenile facilities, despite comprising less than 1% of all youth nationally.
I just have to acknowledge I'm getting a tight chest here. It hurts me to my core on how much these children are vilified at such a young age due to behaviors that are ultimately society letting them down, culture letting them down, systemic racism. So all of these things. And I don't think we're doing our best, not even close. These systems don't work. in fact, it's just perpetuating and exacerbating these issues because kids then have to perform. They have to see this orientation to each other, to other kids like them, gang involvement, all the things that happen as a result to putting kids with this extensive amount of trauma together in a facility. All of it is just a means of survival, to survive the system, just as to survive society, and to survive a culture that is intent on criminalizing them.
And what does it take? Because we're acknowledging in this conversation that we're not doing our best at all. We're not. Could you paint a picture for us of one of these conversations you've had with one of these kids?
Where they were actually able to be vulnerable? Can you tell us about what that experience was like for you and for that person? What stands out in your memory?
Yeah, there's been so many. And I'll probably think about them my entire life, to be honest, because it's so heartbreaking and profound, and their insight and just how sensitive they are. And so I think of one particular person who divulged that they had been abused since the age of 4, physically, sexually, also suffered extreme neglect. I believe this child, though, had never received like a proper neuropsychological evaluation, but I believe that this child was likely on the spectrum. I can't say for sure. There was never an evaluation done. So I'm just talking about direct practice intercession. Divulged these things, was acutely aware how these things have impacted them, such that they gravitated toward drugs and developed an opiate addiction at an extremely young age, had trouble forming relationships, had trouble in school, attention difficulty, all of the things. So all of the things that then this child was also labeled ADHD. Sure, that could be a whole other episode. So the environmental stressors, also living in a really dangerous neighborhood in South Central LA. So all of the things that would make this person extremely vulnerable. And they were, such that they got into trouble with the law, oriented to peers that weren't supportive or mutually supportive. And also it became a matter of, how do I survive in this neighborhood? I have to orient or I'm a target. And I think everyone should read Hold On to Your Kids. And it really gives such a rich understanding of the notion of orientation and how it happens. And to that end, gang involvement, also human trafficking, or could be seen as human trafficking, if you will. So this individual, many overdoses, the constant involvement with the juvenile legal system, all because he could not cope with the trauma that he experienced. And just needing the drugs to forget and to disassociate.
Thank you for sharing that.
How old was this person when you reached them or sitting in front of them?
17. I don't know what happened to this individual. I had heard that he had a drug overdose and survived. I'm not sure what happened, but this is sadly, it's a common occurrence with everyone, obviously, and that substance use connection, and how often these facilities substances are often easy to acquire or bring in. But again, he was aware of what had happened to him, but unable to, maybe not unable, but reticent to explore certain things because being that vulnerable wasn't an option in the environment. It was actually dangerous outside of the therapeutic space, let's say.
And a therapeutic space sounds really challenging. I just keep thinking about also the space to process sounds very challenging in such an environment.
Yeah, for sure. And I think about even how doing the ACE inventories and things like that. And really, it may be seemingly like trivial, not trivial, but just, it's facts, right? Like pragmatically speaking, going in and doing these inventories and these people take these tests and here's our ACEs today. You have this many ACEs. Forgetting that these are human beings and these ACEs, there's a story. There's so many narratives underneath all of these ACEs and what that means for the person that's left behind in their cell.
Absolutely. There's a real responsibility to this sort of awareness. If you're going to open up awareness, what is next? What is available?
True rehabilitation isn't happening. These are just holding pens for human beings that are traumatized, where almost bringing awareness, that person might not have thought of those things as traumatic. It's elucidated, and then what? What now?
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing this forward, as this has been a conversation where I was really talking a lot about these ACEs and their importance. Well, let us not lose light of the human that's taking the questionnaire. Let us not forget about them. What about the moral and ethical considerations of raising these issues? And then what?
Yeah.
I wanted to get back a little bit into a couple things we've touched today. One of the things that's really important in this conversation is dispelling myths, misconceptions that people have. Are there any myths or misconceptions that you would like to address in the space about people who pass through?
I think that they're inherently bad, that they're just bad people who've made bad decisions. I think it's really important to dispel that myth of these are bad people or evil people and the labeling that happens. Because I think, again, so much of it is systems, and there's so many racist systems and institutions, and how that has really perpetuated this. So I think to ignore that aspect of things and the systems, and there's this facade of there's justice being done, there isn't. Maybe arguably compartmentally, it's just our systems are so broken. Justice isn't being done for anyone, because the rates of recidivism are so high, and we're not looking at that. And all of the things we talked about, like school to prison pipeline and foster care to prison pipeline, and just intergenerational trauma, right? Because again, people who are incarcerated and then have children and all of the things. So I think the most important thing is we need to stop looking at it like this black and white thinking over bad, good. People will do things to survive their experience or to survive in general, to support their families. It's about survival and poverty in society that we're looking at, and all the social issues. We don't have viable solutions. So what else are people supposed to do?
We talk about how disproportionate racially the system is and how much higher of a frequency minorities are going through the system and their families are being affected, and the whole ripple of the community that you're talking about. And then it's creating this whole
Non-virtuous loop
within the community with people getting released back in, and the perceptions of this idea of bad. If we want to get back into this philosophical idea of bad, the idea that someone's bad means they're inherently not you, they're separate. And something that I appreciated you said earlier is that you look at all of your clients, you see the experiences, and you're relating to them through the experiences of their life, and you're holding space for them to heal themselves. And it's not like you're separating your clients who've been through the system from your clients who have not. You're meeting them in neutrality, and you're seeing your sameness with them. That was what brought you to it. Your own family members brought you through this work. And when we talk about this theme of disconnection, this is another great place where we can look at our system, our criminal non-justice system, and see that this separation, it's not helping. The statistics that I have for the annual cost, we spend in the US more than $80 billion on prisons, jail systems. This is wild, because the studies vary so much, because how much does it cost per inmate depends on what we look at. Are we looking at a cost per inmate per state? Are we looking at how much we're employing all of the people who work within the system, all of the officers? But I just wanted to drop in that spending can vary from just under $23,000 per prisoner, Arkansas, to $307,000 per inmate, Massachusetts. So we're investing so much resource that maybe people are not aware of into something that just simply is perpetuating trauma.
Absolutely. And there's documentaries out there. I'll give you resource lists. I think of Angela Davis's work. I think everyone should read Are Prisons Obsolete? An incredible book. But they're also generating revenue. So they're making money off of these people. And it's unconscionable. And so to actually be generating profit on the backs of traumatized individuals who are further traumatized and victimized within these systems, again, it's egregious. So again, I like to think that if people were more knowledgeable and society really knew what was going on, there would be more compassion. I think I have to think that, because I want to believe that humans would ultimately do the right thing when they actually have that deeper understanding for people who've experienced these things.
And what do you think is the first step towards that?
And we're going to sound like such a Pollyanna here, but ultimately, I really do believe it's compassion. It's so seemingly trivial, but it is. It's really just genuine compassion and a willingness to be open to possibility that there are other ways, better ways to address these issues, to treat trauma that's complex, to address and reform systems in a way that are compassionate, that are centered in, and again, looking at trauma as opposed to behavior and a narrative or pathologies. So much of it is also like education. And so looking at how this stuff is even marketed to us.
That's a great point for us to arrive to right here. We're seeing how this plays into the political arena and into our belief system.
The goodness and the badness, how we're marketed. That's largely done through politics. That's largely today, it's done by these tough on crime politicians. And I'd really challenge anyone listening to really get out of the fear for a moment and get out of the separation space of getting the bad stuff taken out of society and corralled away somewhere.
Can you talk about the roles that shame and ostracizing play in this arena as well?
So people are ostracized, and the shame, they rely on that shame. And we just accept it. So I think being direct and questioning the narratives and stopping the narrative to say, okay, I understand this is a narrative that is being fed to us and has been for years and years. Is it true? Let's stop it and let's look at what is actually going on. What is this system doing? We know what it's doing, but just really the layers. And I think also everyone involved in it who abets it, because I think people are also attracted to professions sometimes without having done the work of why. Why do you want to be a prison guard and be brutal and brutalize people? Not saying they all do, but there are people like that who are saying they're bad, right? But again, I think it all stems from everyone needs to do their personal work before we can really affect change on that level.
What I'm really feeling into as you're talking is also, there's a couple things. The first one that I'm feeling into is the audacity to look and to see. That's the window into compassion. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to the Compassionate Prison Project, Step into a Circle. It was used in the Wisdom of Trauma film for people. I dare you to watch this and not be deeply moved by these people who are in prison, referencing the ACE study, being asked, have you ever been hit so hard that it left a bruise when you were growing up? Step into the circle. These kinds of questions. That's the willingness to look and to see, because A, it's not working, and B, it's utterly inhumane, and it's keeping us in separation. And when you talk about the prison guards and the people who are enmeshed in the system, we're pointing to this non-virtuous cycle of who benefits from the system, who benefits from prisons continuing as they are. And so I am now thinking, Brooke, about, I'm back at that 17-year-old, the story you told us earlier about how you'll remember this for the rest of your life. And I'm thinking about all the people holding space and witnessing, and all of the secondary trauma that happens from hearing these stories. And I was wondering if you would speak a little bit on what you've seen in your work and like how you must continue to take care of yourself.
So I think this notion of compassion fatigue isn't real to me because I've never felt it. I don't believe in it because I think We just have to be in our bodies, feeling our emotions and knowing there's no bad emotions and being open to what comes up. I think feeling the sadness that comes up when it comes up and being with the sadness. So almost performing like an inquiry on myself and being in my body and noticing what's happening when holding space, but then afterwards, so acknowledging what's coming up, the feelings that are coming up, the physical responses, the emotional responses, so that in that caring for myself, also, I think beneficial for everyone to have their own therapist, especially compassionate inquiry practitioner, also acknowledging perceptions and belief, this constant process of examining, exploring what's happening within ourselves, within myself, and how that's crucial to doing great work, but also taking care of myself, oneself.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up this idea of compassion fatigue, which for someone listening who doesn't know what that means, it's this idea that you can get burnt out from all of the compassion that you're giving out into the world. And I think that one of the ways that we can protect ourselves from this notion of burnout is really crucial of acknowledging when you're triggered and understanding that if you're triggered, you can't actually be of service. And you've got to pause. You've got to take a break. I don't think that is alive and well in the industry here of helping people. You just keep pushing through it and not feeling it. So compassion inquiry is truly a disruptive paradigm. Would you agree?
Yeah, for sure. Because I think to be triggered then means there's always things I think we can be exploring because we're moving through life and it ebbs and flows and situationally things happen. So it's just being able to engage with what comes up and go, oh, I may have thought I worked on that 11 years ago, but there it is again. And it's evolved. It's taken a different form and sometimes I think in our work with clients, if we're triggered, or sometimes there's hints, like maybe a memory comes up and, well, I haven't thought of that for so many years. There's a reason it came up. So are we willing to drop in and explore it? And I love those moments. I think they're gifts, and some of the gifts that we get through being a practitioner too, because it's not a coincidence. And I think when we're acquiring trauma relationally, we need to heal it relationally. And so again, it's that gift of the person in front of us is likely going to reflect something in us that is potentially unhealed, or even just something that we might want to explore and go deeper in. Maybe it's quote unquote healed, but there's a nuance that maybe we didn't understand.
Where you're landing me, Brooke, is back in this, what is the one step we all need to take as a collective to start to heal our system, our criminal non-justice system and its compassion? But there's nuance that starts to break down, right? And there's looking at when we're triggered, when our fear is triggered by this idea that there's bad people out there, that in itself is an opportunity to be with our fear. It's an invitation for a wider compassionate inquiry societally, right?
Yeah. And to say, okay, so I'm fearful. What am I fearful of? What is my belief right now about this person or about this issue or about whatever it is? And being able to look at that and understand, okay, this is a belief. It doesn't mean I'm right. This is a belief and this is a fear I have. And just knowing that's relative to my experience, not necessarily the collective. So I think, again, not abetting these systems by not saying anything. I think it's important to be direct and to speak up. Like if you hear someone talking negatively about anything, whether it's the juvenile legal system, kids who gang youth, or I don't know, anything, to say, it's interesting that you say that. What do you believe about that? What do you make it mean? And to really question things, I think to have that inquiry piece and that curiosity, and not in a judgmental way, but just in a genuine way where it's like, why do you believe that? What do you believe and why? Because I think part of the culture that we've created that is so toxic is that in these hashtags or whatever, we're shutting down the conversation and we're limiting it. We need to do better. We need to have more conversation around these things. And then that will foster a greater compassion because we'll be informing each other, educating each other, inviting possibility and openness.
Yeah, I feel like curiosity is the word of the decade. It's the most paradigm shifting word away from judgment and into curiosity, openness, questioning. My wish for everybody listening who does so much is dip a toe into working within the carceral system and people who've come out of it, that they can connect with this modality of compassionate inquiry, because it will bring you back in touch with your own humanity of why you did this in the first place. It will kindle that spark. It will rekindle the fire in the belly that Brooke was talking about, that I felt all the way through this conversation. And it's the path of humanizing all of us. And I'm thinking just as much about the people who work within the system. By virtue of working in the system, you have been a part of the system and you've experienced the traumas of the system. And I do believe, as Satharam said in the conversation we shared on the show, that compassionate inquiry represents a paradigm shift. There are a few places I can imagine this potential is greater than within our carceral system. I just have one more question for you. That is, what keeps you there when this work is so challenging and you do still find yourself in the minority with this gift of compassionate inquiry and of offering it? What keeps you there?
Possibility, truly, is just knowing, like you said, that this exists and the potential for paradigm shift and bearing witness to what the approach does and truly like the effects. And so I think that believing in something so deeply, I believe in the possibility of change and that things can be better.
What I know is that your presence there is no doubt casting that ripple of possibility wherever you go.
Yeah, I believe in it.
And so I'm just so grateful you're there.
Thanks for what you do and for what everyone does that's involved in compassionate inquiry. I think it's just important for neutrality. And like you said before, it helps everyone. It's really a communal thing.
Yeah, Brooke, I thank you for this time. I thank you for taking care of yourself so that you can continue. And yeah, I see you as a sister. I'm just so grateful that you're there. And thank you for being here today.
The Gifts of Trauma is a weekly podcast that features personal stories of trauma healing, transformation, and the gifts revealed on the path to authenticity. Listen on Apple, Spotify, all podcast platforms. Rate, review, and share it with your clients, colleagues, and family. Subscribe and you won't miss an episode. Please note, this podcast is for informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for personal therapy or a DIY formula for self-therapy. We'd like to thank you for being here today, and we'd also like to thank our guests, as well as Gabor Mate, Satharam Kaur, and the Compassionate Inquiry admin team, marketing team, and podcast team. Please join us again next week to hear more stories of transformation and healing through compassionate inquiry.